Welcome back to My Life, His Story, presented by Reboot Recovery. As always, I'm Bryan Flannery, and this week we have a very special guest. We have Mr. Henry Walker joining us.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for joining us, my friend. I'm excited to walk through your story and to just explore some things. And I guess I'll just kind of kick it off with, tell me about what your world looked like growing up.
Oh, man. You know, there's always been a running joke. I'm kind of the old guy around, but I'll be 65 coming up in January. So mine was in the 60s, I guess, as you want to call it. But I grew up on a farm. It's the easy way to look at it.
Okay.
And so there wasn't a lot of money. That was just, we grew up on a farm.
Sure.
And there was divorce. My mom divorced my dad when I was 4. And so I grew up having to look for, I guess, a father figure in my grandfather was probably the easiest way to look at it. And but my normal daily life was in an abusive cycle, I guess, if that's what you want to call it. My grandmother wasn't the nicest person in the world, and apparently I wasn't her favorite friend. So she knew how to be, in an easy way to look at it, mean-spirited is a way. Now, put it this way, we went to church every Sunday. Every Sunday. Went to church on Sunday nights, went to Bible school during the week. But the weekly sessions or the weekly living consisted of work and
Sure.
physical abuse from my grandmother. That was an easy way to look at it. That was the early years. And just to put it out in the stratosphere, that was normal life to me at that point in time.
Sure.
Yeah.
And through that time, I mean, you know, working with thousands of people who have experienced trauma, specifically as a child, you do think it's normal.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's usually not until you get older, you move away, and you start to look back and realize, like, wait a second, maybe that wasn't as normal as I thought it was.
You are correct. And that happened to me a little over, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago. And now remember, I just said, I'll be 65 in January,
Yeah.
all right? So I was at the age of 60, and I think you and I had a conversation. Remember, you know that I owned a business. And you and I had a conversation about abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And I had realized that I was having flashbacks and night terrors and all this stuff because of the past.
Yeah.
And because of what I thought was normal, I was starting to realize was not normal.
Wow. And so for almost, 50 plus years,
Mm-hmm.
you just kind of carried it.
Carried it. Yeah, hid it in my pocket.
And in that 50 years, it's not like you were just sitting in one spot rocking in a rocking chair. I mean, in that time, you joined the Navy, retired from the Navy,
Correct.
became a physical therapist on post on Fort Campbell, did that for 20 years, retired there.
And did that again for the Army for another 15. Yeah. There was so much involved with it. And you don't think about how much life can throw at you. Because my younger days was physical and verbal abuse. And then came another transitional time. My mom remarried, and I had a stepdad. And now, to preface this just a little bit.
So at first, because you had talked earlier about looking for this father figure.
Mm-hmm.
So this stepdad enters your life, and young Henry is like, here it is.
Exactly.
Here's what I wanted. Here's my father figure.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And in that whole time, that was when I think life was like supposed to be that really, really cool time. Bicycles and friends and camping trips and fishing trips and, all those things that you're supposed to do when you grow up. And those occurred. And go back again, I was still in church. We went to church every Sunday. I was part of the youth group. But the normal, what I thought my normal was, with the physical and the verbal abuse, that normal switched to sexual abuse. So I became sexually abused from the age of, say, 7, 8, up until I was almost 14.
Wow.
Yeah. And so my normal flipped from what I thought was normal to a different type of normal. And I didn't know how to deal with that. And I think that's where I started hiding a lot of emotions and a lot of feelings and stuff like that. I hid so many things because I was afraid to say anything.
Would you say that that was out of shame, regret, guilt?
I've thought about that so many times. I couldn't tell my friends because that's just something you don't tell your buddies.
Right.
And I was afraid to tell my mom because of threats that had thrown at me.
Sure.
And so the only way I knew how to adapt was to hide it, or just you suck it up. And my life was told, you know, you don't cry about things. Guys don't cry. And so you hide things. And that's what I did. And I did that for years. I hid it and hid it and hid it and didn't tell anyone at all.
Wow. So let me ask you, 14-year-old Henry dealing with this trauma, right?
Correct.
Of being, both physically abused younger now and verbally abused, now sexually abused. What impact, now at 65, looking back, what impact did that have on your life, the hiding it?
Man, it has affected a lot of the ways I think sometimes. I have a problem with confrontation. It's so hard for me to deal with confrontation of any kind.
Wow.
It's because knowing there's a dynamic there in my mind that says, just put it away. Just do what you got to do and put it away. And thus I don't deal with confrontation at all. And I'm slowly, believe it or not, after years and years and years and going through Reboot, learning how to adapt and how to face confrontation. Even today, this morning, I had the thought process in my brain says, stop. But I said, no, it's okay. And I went ahead, did it, and once I did it, everything was fine. But that's the biggest thing. And then anxiety. I've suffered with anxiety for, oh gosh, as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talk about hiding it, and in my work with people who have experienced trauma, there's always this group of people that I call the stuffers, right? Where the things that happen in their life, the things that they go through, they take everything and they just stuff it down into a sack,
right?
And they throw it over their shoulder, and they feel confident that as long as that sack stays closed, everything's going to be okay.
Correct.
The problem is it ends up almost being like a volcano, right? Because no matter how hard you stuck it, I once had a participant tell me that they took everything they had been through in their life on deployments as a child, and they stuck it down in this sack, then they threw the sack into a chest, and then they wrapped the chest with chains and dipped it in cement and dug a hole in the middle of the ocean, and they buried it and put more cement on it, and they were sure that that was never going to open. The problem is it always opens.
Right.
And generally when it opens, it's not yourself that you end up hurting. It's the people around you, the people that are closest to you.
Right.
Right. And so when you talked about, hiding and stuffing and putting it away, were there times that you can look back now and see that that's exactly what was causing some of the stress or frustration in your life, was that surfacing?
Oh, I'm sure it was. My oldest son is 43 this year. And I know that our relationship has been damaged because of my past and how I've hid things, because I didn't know how to confront people.
Sure.
I was hard for me to confront his mother. So that in turn by itself by hiding my emotions, I would sit in my apartment or wherever I was living while I was in the Navy, and I would suffer by myself, knowing that I wanted to see my son and I couldn't face confrontation.
Mm.
And then suffer with anxiety because I couldn't see him. And then thus not seeing him built a wall between us over 30-something years.
Wow. So you have all these things that you're kind of facing with your oldest son, the fear of confrontation with the mom, and so as you said, you're kind of suffering in silence, suffering on your own.
Mm-hmm.
How long did that last for?
Oh man, believe it or not, until I retired from the Navy in about 2005. Now to go back a
Sure.
little bit,
Yeah.
when I was 14, I got to go on a summer trip with a friend, and I met his grandmother, and his grandmother was she was just a godly woman, and she shared something with me that I'd never heard before. Remember I said I'd been in church before,
Sure.
right? And I was been in a Methodist church, and I'm not picking on the Methodists, but no one had ever shared with me the gospel. I'd never heard about Jesus at all.
Wow.
And his grandmother shared with me about Jesus, and there was something inside of me that said, you do not ever want to be separated from God, period. And it scared me, like to the bone scared me. And I remember when she shared with me, there was something that I knew I wanted. And I got to go to this little bitty Baptist church, and they did an altar call, and I went up and accepted Christ. I said the sinner's prayer and admitted I was a sinner and confessed that he was Lord. And I don't know, I mean, being at 14, it's also when the abuse stopped.
Wow.
Now, I feel and have for many, many years that God has always been with me. Everywhere I've been. It didn't matter what the situation was. It didn't matter what I was going through. He's always been with me. I didn't have a big fireworks moment. I didn't have that fall on my knees on my face moment. I've just known that God's always been with me. And I sat back and I realized that he was there with me in all of the situations, the verbal abuse, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse. He was sitting there telling me it was okay, I got you. And I've always known he was right there with me.
Wow.
And that, when I sit back today, I realize that how much comfort there is knowing that he was always there.
And of course, at 14, you know, you hear the gospel, you respond to the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this false narrative, right? That you respond to the gospel, you give your life to Christ, and life's gumdrops rainbows. So that's it, right? You had no more trials, no more tribulation, nothing else in life ever, right? The last 51 years, 41 years, whatever, has just been fantastic, amazing, praise God.
Well, can I? No. No. Not only does it go skewed sideways, I learned what alcohol was.
Mm.
And I learned that at 15. And the little funny thing that I always share with people, when you're the only kid in the neighborhood with a full-burn mustache, you get nominated to go buy a beer. That's just what happened, you know. So I learned about alcohol. And I learned what it can do. I also learned what it doesn't do. Also learned that divorce happens. I got married at a young age. I was married at 19. Had a son at 20. Was divorced by 22. Married again. Joined the Navy. Divorced again. Married again. And divorced again. And yeah, I mean, life throws curveballs. Hard curveballs, and
sure.
Sometimes sometimes you're just not prepared for it, or not mentally ready to accept what life has thrown at you.
you know, one of the things we always talk about is, you know, the reactions to trauma, right? We deny, cry, numb, then we run.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so far in your story, even from a young age, we heard the deny, right? You thought it was normal, and then you hid.
Right.
Right. You kind of talked about the cry, and I think sometimes when we talk about cry, we think that it's an emotion, right? When you hear the word cry, you just assume tears and whatnot, but sometimes crying can be even crying out. Like you had talked about knowing God was with you, and I think in the pain, we do end up crying out to God. But then you just talked about the numbing.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Where alcohol and women, it sounds like, is how you were trying to numb.
Right.
And then running, it sounds like, you know, you knew who God was, but it did sound like you were running.
I can definitely say that, because I knew inside of me, I knew what was right. I knew exactly the right moves to make, but I also knew if I go over here, if nobody sees me do it, it'll be okay. And I did run from God on many occasions. I know I ran from God, and I knew in my heart that I was running. There were certain instances I can remember so many times. Somebody would invite me to church, so I'd go, and I would get this great elation thing, and then I would look for excuses not to go back.
Yeah, this like emotional high, right? Like, man, that's so on par to even other conversations you and I have had and we've had with other people, right? Where you go in and you feel this emotional high, but then you run. You run from that. And I think some of it is real guilt, right? Which we know is conviction.
Right.
Right? Like, because even though you had this emotional high, you left the church, and some of the decisions you probably made right after leaving the church even didn't align with the way that you knew you should be living, because you were also, because you hadn't dealt with all of that trauma in the past, you were still caught up in the numbing.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so I think knowing, man, it's awesome to look back. It's impossible to tell 65 years of a story in, 30 minutes.
Oh, man, yeah, we're right.
It's impossible, and I know that, and I would never attempt to. But even just looking at the key proponents that you've already talked about, right? You have this emotional high, then you go back to numbing. Like, tell me about that. How long, roughly, did that process happen, where you would have these emotional highs with God, and then you would go back to numbing?
Oh, man, I did that up until about 15 years ago.
Wow.
It was so easy. Remember, I made the joke about buying alcohol. It's so easy to buy alcohol and know that you don't need it, but you want it.
Yeah.
And I admit, I still suffer today. I mean, I still have instances today where I want to go have something because I need to hide a feeling. I need to bury it, or I feel like I need to bury it because I want to, if I have a drink, it will calm my nerves. Easy way to put it. And up until about 15 years ago, that was a dominant factor quite often, like weekends. And I sit back today and I even, when I think about it, it's like, man, that was stupid. Because my children were growing up and they were seeing their dad hide emotions by drinking and didn't even know he was hiding his emotions because he was just drinking. And it was the craziest thing to be able to, you didn't try to hide it, you just did it.
Yeah.
And now that I sit back and I can think about the past and see some of the mistakes that I made, and I cringe inside going, man, why did I do that? But when I really sit back and think about it, say, but that's okay. Yeah. It's okay to not be okay sometimes. And I've come to the conclusion that those were just mistakes.
Sure.
And there was a reason for the mistakes. I mean, it was something I did, something I had to deal with. And I finally figured it out. Well, sort of figured it out. Because of my faith and because of my walk over the last 15 to 18 years, my walk has, now I've stumbled and I've slipped, I've skinned my knees a couple of times, but my walk has been on the narrow path because I know what he wants and I know I want to do what he wants.
Yeah.
That's, I don't know if that sounds good. I don't know if that's, in my brain it works.
Yeah, listen, if it works for you, that's all that matters. But let me ask you this. So 2005, retired from the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
You're 43?
46.
46. I was close.
Yeah, you're close.
I'm not good with math.
Thanks for the compliment. You said I was young.
You're 46. By this point, you had been married.
Sam, my wife and I had been married at that point in time. Let's see. We've been married 33 this year. So we've been married a little over 10 years.
Okay. And this was wife number
4.
Wife number 4. And so lessons, right? You call them mistakes. I like to call them lessons.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the best lessons I've ever learned are lessons that I've forced myself to learn.
Correct. You are correct.
So wife number 4, 10 years, retired from the Navy. What was the next step for you? Because you had talked about it at this time, you know, you were still numbing, you were still kind of running, still hiding, I would say.
Right.
Would be the best way to say it.
That's the easy way to say it, yeah.
And so, you know, I think sometimes when people talk about when their life changed, there's this aha moment.
Right.
There's this impactful situation that happens. And, you know, one of the things that I've come to learn, especially even as Christians, right? We love the impactful quick story, right? If you watch HGTV or any of these types of shows, they never talk about the slow grind of somebody that's healing. They never talk about the slow grind of somebody who is battling substance abuse and over time. They always want to talk about the miraculous, like, I just stopped. Or, you know, I went from a high school dropout to a millionaire in 12 hours. Those are the stories that we glorify. Those are the stories that put out. But, you know, for the people that are watching or listening this episode, and for many of the people that I know in my life, that's not their story. It's not the case. It wasn't this, boom, everything changed. Life became gumdrops and rainbows.
Correct.
There was a series of events. And so let me ask you this. What kind of sparked your life going from where it was to where it is?
One was meeting my wife. That was one of the premier spots, was just meeting her. And then we, of course, became friends, and we were both anti-marriage. She had just gotten out of a really, really bad divorce, and I had just gotten out of a really bad divorce, and we became friends, which I think was the key to us having the relationship we've got today. Now, again, we learn. We were roommates, and that's always been a running joke, but we were roommates. And then, funny thing was, my wife asked me to marry her.
Wow.
And so we got married in 1990. And both of us, our past being kind of parallel, she had been physically abused by her husband and she was divorced. And my past, as I've said, was had been abused. And we understood each other quite well. And we knew we needed to go to church. We both knew in our hearts we needed to go to church. And so we did. we started visiting the local church. We had friends there, and then we got the chance to adopt. And we'd only been married for 6 months. And my wife had just lost a really, really close friend, and we were able to adopt my middle son at 2 days old. And the pastor was influential in getting him to us, because he was our in between the city and everything else. And we knew it was, we both said on many occasions, still say today, that it was truly a God thing that Alex came into our life. We both got baptized at the same time in the Beaufort River in South Carolina in January, which was, we'll just say, an eye-opening.
Sounds cool.
It was.
Sounds cool.
And it will definitely pull your eyes open when you're doing the Beaufort River in January. But we knew we had to make changes. And that was the first step in getting to where we are today. That was truly watching and seeing my son being delivered to us in our driveway on a Tuesday morning was amazing. And that was one of the first steps that changed us, was that.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Man, I don't know about you, but I am enthralled in Henry's story. I mean, he talks about all the abuse and trauma as a child and how that kind of led him to a road of bad decision making, right, and numbing and running and hiding in these things. And he just talked about the spark that started the change in his life. And don't miss the next episode where we continue to find out how Henry Walker got from where he was to where he is, right here on My Life, His Story.